A police officer pulled me over less than an hour after I landed back in Los Angeles. I had been driving home from the airport after a 3-day business trip to Seattle. I was tired, thinking about seeing my wife Carly again and already imagining what we would have for dinner. Instead of asking for my license and registration, the officer looked at me strangely and said, "Wouldn't you rather drive straight to the hospital?" I thought he was joking. Is this some sort of joke? He handed my license back without even looking at it. Then his expression changed. "I just got radioed in about what happened. I'm terribly sorry for your loss." Before I could ask what he meant, he returned to his cruiser, turned on his lights, and pulled ahead of me. He blocked traffic long enough for me to merge into the faster lane. I sat there frozen. What loss? I called Carly. No answer. That wasn't unusual. She taught kindergarten and often kept her phone on silent during class. But then I called again, straight to voicemail. I tried our home phone. Nothing. I called her sister, her mother, and finally my own mother. Nobody answered. My mind immediately went to the worst possibilities. A car accident. Something at her school, a medical emergency. Then I remembered the officer's words. Loss. I called my brother Harvey. His wife Paulina answered, and the second I heard her crying, my stomach dropped. "How can she do this?" she kept saying. "What happened? Where's Carly?" She couldn't answer. Harvey took the phone from her, but after a few broken words, the call ended. I called back repeatedly. Nothing. At that point, I was driving far faster than I should have been. I didn't care about the traffic around me. I needed to know what had happened to my wife. The nearest trauma center to Carly's school was only a few exits away. I pulled into the hospital parking lot, abandoned my car, and ran inside. "I'm looking for my wife, Carly Munoz. She was brought here." The nurse typed something into her computer. When she looked back at me, her eyes were already wet. "The security guard will escort you." That scared me more than anything. A security guard led me through several hallways and into an elevator. When the doors opened, I saw a sign for the pediatric ICU. I stopped. Why would I be in pediatrics? Then I heard crying, not one person, several. As we approached the room, I recognized the voices. My brother Harvey, Paulina, Carly's parents, my mother. Everyone I had been trying to call was already there. The guard opened the door. Everyone turned toward me. Nobody spoke. I pushed through the room because I needed to see Carly for myself. There were 3 covered beds. 2 were adult. The third was much smaller, a child. I felt my knees weaken. Carly was there. She looked peaceful, but she was gone. The other adult was Carlos, the janitor who always smiled and waved whenever I picked Carly up from school. The child was a 5-year-old boy named Thiago. My entire body gave out, and Harvey caught me. I couldn't understand how I had gone from worrying about dinner to standing in a hospital room with my wife dead. A detective entered the room soon afterward. His name was Richard Hoffman. He sat down beside me and explained that they were investigating what had happened, but the preliminary findings pointed to carbon monoxide poisoning inside Carly's classroom. I stared at him. Carbon monoxide? Inside a kindergarten classroom? It didn't make sense. Detective Hoffman explained that Carly had stayed late the previous afternoon preparing lessons for the next day. Carlos had been cleaning the classroom, as he did every Thursday. Thiago had been waiting there after school until his parents could pick him up. Another teacher had discovered all 3 of them after coming into the room around 6:30. By then, it was too late. Then the detective told us something that made the situation even harder to accept. The heating system in that section of the school had been malfunctioning for weeks. There had been maintenance requests. There had been complaints. There had been warning. The old boiler was apparently allowing carbon monoxide to enter the ventilation system, and because of the way the ducts were arranged, the gas had accumulated inside that particular room. This wasn't some completely unpredictable tragedy. There had been warning signs. They simply hadn't been acted upon. A couple suddenly rushed into the room. Thiago's parents, Xavier and Danielle Matlock. The moment Danielle saw her son, she collapsed. Xavier held her while she cried, and the entire room seemed to break apart all over again. Eventually, we were moved into a family waiting area. 2 grieving families, 1 grieving husband. None of us had any idea how we were supposed to make sense of what had happened. Xavier kept asking the same question. Why didn't the detectors work? The detective explained that the detectors in that section of the building hadn't been properly checked in more than a year. Then the principal arrived. She looked completely devastated. She kept apologizing and explaining that budget cuts had delayed the heating repair. But then she admitted something that made all of us furious. The district had money. They had simply chosen to spend it elsewhere. The heating repairs had been delayed while funds were allocated toward new computers. I couldn't stop thinking about Carly. The night before, she had texted me that she felt dizzy and had a headache. She had assumed she was exhausted. She even joked about needing more coffee. If she'd known what those symptoms meant, maybe she would have left. If anyone had recognized the pattern, maybe all 3 of them would still be alive. But who expects carbon monoxide poisoning in a kindergarten classroom? That was the terrifying part. It had been hiding in a place everyone assumed was safe. As the investigation continued, more people arrived. Carlos's family came in. Rosa, his wife, was devastated. She explained that Carlos always worked late on Thursdays because he took pride in making the kindergarten rooms spotless before Friday morning. He had been doing that for years. She told us he had been planning to retire the following year. They had been saving money for a trip to Mexico so he could visit relatives he hadn't seen in years. He had plans. Carly had plans too. Everyone did. Carly was supposed to come home and complain about how tired she was. We were supposed to have our usual pizza night. She always ordered Hawaiian pizza. I always complained about the pineapple. It was one of those stupid little arguments couples have for years. I would never have guessed that the last time we had that argument would already be behind us. The principal then revealed something even more disturbing. Several teachers had complained about headaches and dizziness over the previous 2 weeks. She had email. 3 teachers had specifically reported feeling sick when they stayed late in their classroom. Nobody had connected the complaints to the heating system. The detective detective immediately wrote down their name. He told the principal that every one of them needed to be examined. Then a fire department official arrived with preliminary air quality result. The carbon monoxide levels in the classroom had been dangerously high. The 3 victims had probably become tired and disoriented before losing consciousness. There had been no warning that any of them understood. That knowledge didn't make the grief disappear. If anything, it made the situation feel even crueler. Carly hadn't been careless. Carlos hadn't been careless. Thiago certainly hadn't been. They had simply trusted a building that was supposed to protect them. Thiago's father was holding his son's backpack when he told us about him. Thiago loved school. He loved Carly. He would practice writing his name at home because he wanted to show his teacher what he had learned. He had recently been chosen as a classroom helper and was incredibly proud of himself. The classroom had been his happy place. That was what broke me. Carly loved teaching those children. She spent her own money on supplies. She decorated the room. She stayed late. She helped students who were struggling. She gave more than the school ever asked of her. And that dedication had kept her in that room long enough for a preventable danger to take her life. The detective eventually asked if we wanted to pursue criminal charges against the district. At first, I couldn't even process the question. I didn't want lawyers. I wanted my wife back. Xavier answered immediately. Yes. His voice was broken, but there was no hesitation. I eventually nodded too, because this wasn't simply something tragic that had happened. There had been maintenance requests. There had been complaint. There had been warning, and someone had decided those warnings could wait. News vans began gathering outside the hospital. The story was spreading. 3 people dead after a gas leak at a local school. Seeing the headline on Harvey's phone made everything feel strangely official. This wasn't just our private nightmare anymore. It was a story. People would read about it while eating breakfast. People who had never met Carly would know her name. Reporters would talk about the school district. Officials would make statements. But for us, none of that changed the empty beds in that hospital room. Carly's parents arrived later that night. Her mother broke down the moment she saw me. We held on to each other. There were no words, only grief. The superintendent eventually spoke to the families by phone. He promised full cooperation. He promised support. He said the district would do everything necessary. His words sounded rehearsed. I had heard enough promises by then. Rosa told us Carlos had complained about a strange smell in the building the previous week. He had reported it. Someone told him it was probably old pipe. Another warning, another chance, another opportunity to prevent this. Missed. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death for all 3, carbon monoxide poisoning. The paperwork began: death certificates, insurance forms, funeral arrangements, documents, signatures, questions about burial or cremation. It was surreal. The previous day, I had been thinking about what Carly and I would eat for dinner. Now I was being asked how many copies of her death certificate I needed. My brother Harvey took over as much as he could. He called funeral homes because I couldn't. He organized things because I couldn't think. I had always been the older brother who protected everyone. Now my little brother was the one holding me together. Around midnight, the hospital staff told us there was nothing more we could do that night. Leaving felt wrong. I didn't want to walk away from Carly, but eventually Harvey convinced me to come home with him. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to my house alone. Our house was full of Carly, her coffee mug, her clothes, her perfume, her books, her shoes by the door. Every ordinary object would suddenly become a reminder that she wasn't coming back. So I went to Harvey and Paulina's house. I barely slept. I kept replaying my last conversation with Carly. She had sounded tired but happy. She had told me about an art project her students were working on. I kept thinking about the one thing I should have said differently. I should have told her I loved her one more time. The next morning, the news was everywhere. The superintendent announced his resignation. He claimed he accepted responsibility, but resignation wasn't enough. 3 people were dead. The funerals were held 4 days later at a community center because no church in the area was large enough. 3 caskets stood side by side. Carly's was surrounded by drawings from her students. Carlos's had flowers from families whose classrooms he had cleaned for years. Thiago's was surrounded by toys and stuffed animals. Thousands of people came. Teachers, parents, students, neighbors, people who had never met the families but wanted to show their support. Teachers talked about Carly's dedication. Parents talked about Carlos's kindness. Thiago's teachers talked about how bright and happy he had been. Every story was comforting and painful at the same time, because every sentence used the past tense. 6 weeks later, Detective Hoffman called me to the police station. The investigation had been completed. 3 district administrators were facing criminal negligence charges. The evidence showed that administrators had known about the heating problem. There were emails discussing the repair. There were maintenance requests. There were warnings from the heating company. And there were discussions about delaying the work until summer. They had decided it was cheaper to wait. The district's lawyers tried to describe the deaths as an accident. The prosecutor disagreed. When known safety problems are repeatedly ignored and people die as a result, calling it an accident doesn't erase the decisions that came before it. Xavier received the same update. That night he called me. Neither of us celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate, but there was a small sense that someone was finally being held accountable. 2 weeks later, Xavier asked me to meet him at a coffee shop. He brought a folder. Inside were pages of notes. He wanted to create a foundation, something that would push for better safety inspections in schools, something that would make sure no other parent received a phone call like the ones we had received. We spent hours talking. Mandatory carbon monoxide detectors, regular heating inspection, better reporting systems, independent safety check, clear procedures for teachers who reported symptoms. We knew we couldn't bring Carly, Carlos, or Thiago back, but maybe we could keep another family from experiencing the same nightmare. The foundation paperwork took months. We named it the Carly, Carlos, and Thiago Safety Foundation. Soon other parents started reaching out, then teachers, then school employees, people who had their own stories about about ignored maintenance requests and unsafe building. 3 months after the tragedy, I returned to work part-time. I couldn't handle full days yet. My coworkers didn't know what to say. Most simply hugged me or put a hand on my shoulder. My boss had moved my desk so I wouldn't have to look toward the school district building. It was a small thing, but I appreciated it. 4 months after the death, the district made a settlement offer. It was worth millions. The number made me sick. Money couldn't replace Carly. It couldn't bring Carlos home to Rosa. It couldn't give Xavier and Danielle their son back. Our lawyers explained that the settlement was fair and that a trial could take years. Eventually, we accepted. But Xavier and I agreed that most of the money should go toward the foundation. Keeping money from the tragedy felt wrong. Using it to prevent another tragedy felt different. Rosa agreed. She used part of her settlement to create education funds for her children. Carlos had always worried about their future. Now his children would have opportunities because of the man he had been. 5 months after the tragedy, Xavier called me again. His voice sounded different, still sad, but lighter. Danielle was pregnant. They weren't trying to replace Thiago. Nobody could. They simply needed to find a way to keep moving forward. We both cried on the phone. That conversation taught me something I hadn't understood before. Grief and hope could exist at the same time. You could miss someone desperately and still allow yourself to imagine a future. 6 months after losing Carly, I finally returned to her classroom. The new principal met me at the door. I had avoided the place for months because I knew it would destroy me. Inside were all the little pieces of Carly's life. Her reading corner, her art supply, the decorations she had bought herself, notes from students, lesson plans. Everything was still there. I packed what I could. Then I donated most of it to new teachers. Carly would have wanted those supplies to keep helping children. I couldn't keep the classroom frozen forever. 8 months after the tragedy, the safety regulations we had fought for finally passed at the state level. Schools would now be required to have carbon monoxide detectors in classrooms and conduct regular heating system inspection. The law was named the Carlos and Thiago Act. Standing there during the signing ceremony was one of the strangest moments of my life. I hated that their names had to become a law. I hated that their death were the reason anyone was paying attention. But if their names could save even one family from what we had experienced, then their lives would continue to matter in a way the people responsible could never erase. 10 months later, Rosa called me. She had met someone through grief counseling. She was getting married. She told me Carlos would always be part of her family. At her wedding, she carried a photograph of him inside her bouquet. Her children lit candles in his memory. It wasn't about forgetting him. It was about allowing love to continue. A year after Carly, Carlos, and Thiago died, the families met at the cemetery. They were buried close together, overlooking the hill. We talked about everything that had happened. The foundation had helped inspect hundreds of schools. The new safety requirements were protecting students and staff. The foundation was still growing. Xavier and Danielle brought their new baby, a little girl named Hope. The name felt perfect. We stood there talking about people who should have been standing beside us, people we would never stop missing. But I finally understood something. Moving forward doesn't mean leaving someone behind. Carly would always be part of me. Every time I helped with the foundation, she was there. Every school we helped make safer carried a piece of her legacy. Every teacher who received support reminded me of the woman who had spent her life helping children. Every child protected by the new safety laws represented something she would have cared about. The sun was setting when we finally left the cemetery. I thought about the police officer who had pulled me over that terrible day. He had known before I did. He had seen the pain coming and tried to make the road easier for me. At the time, I couldn't understand why he had let me go. Now I understood. He wasn't giving me permission to speed. He was giving me a clear path toward the people waiting for me. And that became one of the strangest memories of the worst day of my life. I had started that morning thinking I was simply driving home after a business trip. I expected Carly to be waiting. I expected our normal Thursday night. I expected another argument about pineapple on pizza. Instead, I lost the person I loved most. But I also learned that grief doesn't have to be the end of a story. It can become action. It can become change. It can become a foundation. It can become a law. It can become a warning that saves someone else. Carly, Carlos, and Thiago should still be here. Nothing will ever change that. But their names are now attached to protections that didn't exist before. And every time those protections prevent another family from receiving the phone call we received, I know we did something worthwhile with the pain they left behind. I still miss Carly every day. Some days are easier, some aren't. Sometimes I still reach for my phone because I want to tell her something stupid. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking about pizza night. Sometimes I remember her laughing at my complaints about pineapple, and for a second, everything feels normal. Then I remember. But I don't try to erase those memories anymore. They're mine. She is still part of my life because I carry everything she taught me. She taught children to read. She taught them to be curious. She taught them to believe in themselves. And after she was gone, she helped teach an entire community that safety warnings cannot be ignored. That might not be the ending any of us wanted, but it's the legacy she deserved. Carly didn't die because she failed. Carlos didn't die because he made a mistake. Thiago didn't die because anyone could have predicted what was coming. They were failed by adults who were supposed to recognize danger and act. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure the next warning is heard, and the next one, and the next one. Because somewhere right now, a teacher is staying late, a janitor is finishing his shift, a child is waiting for a parent, and they deserve to walk out of that building alive. That's what we fight for now. That's what their names mean. And that's how we keep them with us.
Like and subscribe for more videos like these. Thanks for watching.